So, Tom, we're all on Gallant watch, I guess, coming up, because on Tuesday, the Premier himself, after all the other ministers who have so far testified at the inquiry, he will be up there on his own. And, it's funny thinking about this, and I think I might have said this earlier in the week, just by virtue of the fact that he will be there in person, I'd have to think that's not a good look.
It's not a good look. He's the one who called this commission. So at least that part is positive for him, because he knew he was looking at such a mess. There was no way for him to keep shoveling this thing forward. Somebody else from the outside was going to have to take a good hard look at exactly the way Judge Charbonneau looked at the construction industry and all the corruption there. What was unexpected, of course, is that he'd have to testify himself at the very moment it was becoming clear that they, at the SAAQ, they'd been blocking police access to information about serious cases, alleged cases of fraud and basically taking taxpayers' money. That sort of corruption, by the way, and I think he deserves credit for it, that sort of corruption has been essentially non-existent on the political side. So as far as the elected officials are concerned, François Legault has run a very clean ship, very tight. He's had very tough rules in place. He made it very clear that nobody was going to get away with any of the shenanigans that existed under the Charest regime that led to the Charbonneau Commission of Inquiry. And there has been none of that. But there are two sides to the equation of corruption. Yes, it can be on the political side and the politicians and the elected officials, but it can also be the civil service. And there was one guy, Aaron, that I worked with for years, much more experienced than I was provincially when I came in. And he said, Thomas, he says, they're always going to come after us, and they're right to do it if there's anything done wrong by an elected official. But he said, believe me, there's a lot of corruption amongst the senior civil servants as well. So I just keep thinking of that as we're looking at this thing. You're using the SAAQ to plead solicitor-client privilege to stop the UPAC, this special unit that we have to go against corruption of the police. You're blocking them pleading solicitor-client privilege, whereas the client, who's François Legault, he's the head of government and it's the government, they never asked to have anything excluded. And this is something concocted by the lawyers at the SAAQ to try to stop the anti-corruption police from looking at what they've been up to. It is galling. And I think that this is the type of thing that's going to hurt Legault personally long-term. Not that he's been corrupt, not that any of his ministers have been corrupt, because as I say, no evidence ever of any of that. But it's the whole stinking enterprise, the grotesque incompetence, throwing hundreds of millions of dollars out the windows. This is taxpayers' money, and those things are never forgiven by the voters.
So taking all that into account, and I asked this question when I started the show today, that and everything else we've talked about in the past, right? The Northvolt issue, the Lion Electric issue, what's happening in healthcare, and on and on and
choices,
on.
By the way.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. So does this, as some have suggested, and this came up on the show yesterday, is it time for François Legault to simply look, at polling numbers, at by-election losses, everything I just mentioned now, and say, you know what, it's time for me to go and call an early election?
My working hypothesis is that he's already reached that decision. Like Trudeau, he was going to try to hit every button on his dashboard, try to go to every tool in his toolbox to try to turn things around. Trudeau, by the way, people seem to have forgotten, at the end of December, Trudeau did a massive cabinet shuffle and then 3 weeks later announced that he was stepping down. So it's the reflex of somebody who's been around for long enough. He can't believe that it's going to end this way, but he knows in his heart of hearts that if he sticks around as leader, that party that he started, and again, Legault deserves credit for this. He stood up and said, you know what, I'm neither a separatist nor a federalist. I'm a strong Quebec nationalist. I just want to have this good government run by accountants. Unfortunately, there was a bunch of accountants who don't know how to count, and this is what we've been stuck with. So yes, I'm convinced, Aaron, that François Legault is going to announce probably in December, January at the latest, to give his party some time to find a new leader, that he's stepping down.
Let me move on from that, and still with provincial politics. I think we may have discussed this a week ago. Lucien Bouchard, who's, of course, involved now in dealing with the government, on representing medical specialists, I think, decided to come out and give Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon a heads up, right? They were both former, or one was a former leader of the PQ, and tell him, you know what, in essence, the polls show you have a chance to win this next election. Don't screw it up by talking about a referendum and separation. And today, or we found out, PSPP saying thank you, but no thank you to Lucien Bouchard's recommendation.
Yeah, because that's his stock and trade. PSPP is not going to be one of those PQ leaders. Like every single one of them, I would say, other than Jacques Parizeau, every one of them has tried to soft pedal their option at some point along the way. Even René Lévesque, who was going to have sovereignty association, as if anybody had ever agreed to association. It was just, it's just a way of trying to put some cotton batting around this very sharp object that is the referendum and the threat of Quebec separation. So, yes, I mean, PSPP has that on the plus side as a politician. And he did try dabbling with the dark art of obscuring what he was up to by saying, in one of the interviews that we had him on for one of the French TV shows that I do, they asked him, and he was no longer talking about a referendum. He said, qu'est-ce qu'il y a de mal à consultation? So what's wrong with a consultation? Well, sorry, is it a referendum? Yeah, it's a referendum. It's a consultation. So it's a game that gets played by separatists, and they could wind up in the trap that Pierre Poilievre went in. Yeah, look, Poilievre's front benchers, his top people in the opposition, they were going around ministerial offices with tape measures trying to find out what kind of drapes they were going to be putting in their new ministerial offices. They forgot one thing. They hadn't won an election yet. I remember on your show, Aaron, one guy getting really, hot under the collar with me because there was a very good poll showing that Poilievre was 27 points ahead. And I had said, this guy's never going to be the Prime Minister of Canada. And the guy says, aha, see? I said, well, he hasn't won anything yet. But Poilievre took that approach, and PSPP is taking the same approach now. He doesn't seem to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the people who have been voting for his PQ party in the by-elections are just expressing their strong desire to get rid of François Legault, the same way people were coalescing around Pierre Poilievre because they saw him as the only channel to get rid of Justin Trudeau. Once Trudeau was gone, and they came in with a brand new leader with a fresh approach and all sorts of new ideas, all of the votes came right back to the Liberals who won the next election. So I think that PSPP is getting a bit ahead of himself here. He believes that there's that many Quebecers. Look, the polling is consistent for the last 40 years. It's approximately 1/3 of Quebecers who would vote yes in a referendum, straight up, straight down. Do you want to leave or not? That's about 1/3. That means 2/3 of Quebecers want nothing to do with it, and that's the reality that PSPP is going to face if he continues to say, oh, yeah, well, we're going straight into a referendum once we get elected.
Tom, 30 seconds. Last thing, just real quick. Yesterday, finding out Jean-François Robert, secularism minister, taking that report that had just been completed and thinking about it for all of 2 days and saying that, yes, now the government will act. They are going to introduce a bill to make public prayer unlawful, I guess we can say. I want to know what your thoughts are on this.
Well, what they're actually saying is they want public prayer by Muslims to be unlawful because I'm Roman Catholic, raised in the church. I've been to processions with the people from the Portuguese community, beautiful processions for different feast days, the Italian community. Heck, even St. Patrick's Day, the parade starts with a green mass at the Basilica. So there is a strong history of taking prayer to public places in Quebec. When they came up with this, it was a clear response to some of the protesters against what has been going on in Gaza and the war between Hamas and Israel. But you don't start banning people's right to pray in public, which is such an obvious breach of fundamental liberties, simply because there's one group of people who have been, doing things that you find particularly offensive. Bill 21, that makes it impossible for members of certain religious minorities who wear certain outward signs, think of a Sikh or a practicing Jew who's wearing a kippah or a Muslim woman wearing a headscarf. They've been told that there's a whole list of government jobs that they're not entitled to. And yet, and they'll try to argue on the CAC side, they'll say, it's not true that it's discriminatory because it doesn't matter as long as you have an outward sign, you're not allowed. But if you actually read Bill 21, Aaron, there's a whole chapter in there that can only apply to Muslim women. So it's a bill, first and foremost, against the Muslim community. And this is also a law that would go against the Muslim community, first and foremost. And if there are other issues of public safety and breaking the law, then deal with them, because we have seen the law being broken. There was a strong ruling by the courts that you're not allowed to get within a certain distance of some of the synagogues, and they named the various places that were going to be protected under that injunction. And the police of the city of Montreal did nothing to enforce that injunction. That's the problem. The problem is not people who are stretching the limit in terms of their expression of their political feelings that they sometimes will use, a religious angle on. But we've got to be so careful before we go along with any of the explanations or justifications of the Quebec government for this stuff, because they're paper thin.
We will leave it at that. Tom, appreciate it as always. Have a great
Take good
weekend.
care, Aaron.
Bye-bye now.
All the best.